The lake was my refuge, a quiet mirror of pine and sky that had belonged to my family for generations. My grandfather built the cabin on its shore with his own hands, rough timber walls, a stone fireplace, and a dock that creaked like an old friend underfoot. To me, it wasn't just a piece of property. It was heritage, memory, and freedom carved into the wilderness. But that freedom had a target on its back. The Lakeshore Meadows Homeowners Association had swallowed nearly every parcel along the water over the last 20 years, bringing with it a thick rulebook and an even thicker sense of authority. Only a few of us remained outside its grip, and I was the most visible reminder that not everyone had bent the knee. Karen Mitchell, president of the HOA, made sure I never forgot it. She was the kind of woman who treated a clipboard like it was a badge and bylaws like divine commandments. Her hair was a rigid blonde helmet, her voice sharp enough to strip bark, and her smile, when she offered one, was the kind you gave before serving a summons. People in the subdivision called her dedicated. I called her relentless. The first skirmishes were almost laughable. A folded note slipped under my cabin door. Your dock is non-compliant with HOA shoreline regulations. A week later, another. Open fire pits are strictly prohibited under HOA environmental rules. Each ended with her signature, Karen M., as if she were stamping official law onto the page. I ignored them. The cabin was older than her entire neighborhood, its deed carved out long before her board existed. None of their rules applied to me. Ignoring her, however, was the worst thing I could have done. By midsummer, she escalated. I found a bright orange notice taped to my canoe, declaring I was in final violation and subject to fines. Another morning, a code enforcement officer appeared at my property randomly, camera in hand, clearly tipped off. Neighbors whispered of Karen's late-night calls, insisting my noncompliance was dragging down everyone's property values. One evening, as my family gathered around the fire pit, Karen marched down the hill like a sheriff in a western, heels stabbing the earth. This cabin, she declared, pointing at the string lights I'd hung between pines, is a blight on the community. Those bulbs are not regulation fixtures. You'll remove them immediately. My cousins exchanged uneasy glances, but I stood my ground. Karen, this isn't your jurisdiction. You don't control me or this cabin. That's the law. Her face flushed crimson. Don't lecture me on the law. Every property touching this lake answers to the board. If you think you're exempt, you're in for a very rude awakening. Then she turned sharply and stormed back uphill, leaving the fire crackling in the heavy silence she had created. I knew then she wouldn't stop. Karen was the type who saw defiance, not as disagreement, but as a personal insult. To her, my independence wasn't just inconvenient, it was intolerable. The weeks that followed were a slow tightening of the noose. My mailbox was dented one morning, as if struck by a bat. Fishing nets I'd left drying were slashed to ribbons. More inspectors appeared, citing vague safety concerns. No one admitted responsibility, but the pattern was clear. Karen wasn't satisfied with bending rules. She wanted submission. And she wouldn't quit until I either surrendered the cabin or broke under the pressure. But what she didn't know was that I had already taken steps to fight back. Quietly, carefully, I'd reached out to someone with the power to put her crusade under a microscope. Someone who could weigh her threats not as petty harassment, but as legal violations with consequences. By autumn, the stage was set. I arranged a private meeting at the cabin, away from prying eyes, certain it was my only chance to secure protection for my family's legacy. Yet before my guest arrived, the inevitable happened. Karen, uninvited and burning with self-righteous fury, crossed the threshold of my cabin without so much as a knock. The air seemed to shift in that moment, the walls themselves aware of the trespass. I stood frozen by the stove, heart pounding, realizing she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. And she had no idea who was waiting at the table behind me. The door slammed against the wall with a crack that shook the cabin's rafters. Karen Mitchell barged in without hesitation, her phone already recording as though she were documenting a crime scene. This property is subject to inspection under Lakeshore Meadows bylaws, she declared, her voice sharp and theatrical. You are in violation of multiple community codes, and I have full authority to enter and document. Her audacity stunned me, though by now I should have expected nothing less. She wasn't just trespassing, she was staking a claim, daring me to challenge her. Karen, I said firmly, standing between her and the living room, you have no right to be here.
Leave. Now.
But she pushed past me, camera lens sweeping across the room like a searchlight. Unapproved heating fixture, she muttered, pointing at the wood stove. Unsafe string lighting. Possible fire hazards. This entire structure could be condemned if the board sees this. She moved with the authority of someone who had bullied others into compliance so many times she believed herself untouchable. Each step of hers scraped against my patience like nails on glass. Then she noticed the man seated calmly at the dining table. He had been silent until now, watching her with the patience of someone accustomed to storms. His suit was sharply pressed despite the rustic setting, his silver hair catching the low light of the cabin lamps. A folder of documents lay open before him, though he hadn't reached for them. Karen's voice faltered. And who exactly are you? She tilted her phone toward him, suspicion etched across her face. Are you a contractor? Some squatter he's hiding? Whoever you are, you're part of this violation, too. The man rose slowly, adjusting his glasses with deliberate care. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and resonant, the kind of voice that filled a courtroom. My name is Daniel Hartman, he said. I am the Attorney General of this state. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen froze. The words seemed to punch the air from her chest. Excuse me, she stammered. Hartman reached into his jacket and produced a leather case, flipping it open with practiced ease. The gold seal caught the firelight, undeniable in its authority. Karen's phone wavered in her grip. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, Hartman replied, his tone clipped but calm. I was invited here today to review reports of HOA misconduct and intimidation. Your conduct just now, entering private property without consent, attempting to enforce rules that do not apply here, illustrates the exact concerns raised in those reports. Karen's face flushed crimson, then pale. This is a misunderstanding. I'm doing my duty. He has been flouting community standards for years, and as president, it's my responsibility. Hartman stepped forward, cutting her off with a raised hand. No, Ms. Mitchell. Your responsibility ends at the borders of your HOA jurisdiction. This cabin is not under your authority, and you know that. What you've just done isn't duty, it's trespassing. Her mouth opened, then closed, struggling for footing. For once, her words didn't flow. I seized the moment. Karen, you've been harassing me for months with phony notices and bogus complaints. You knew you couldn't touch me legally, but you kept pushing. Tonight, you crossed a line you can't erase. Karen's eyes darted between us, fury simmering beneath her panic. You're exaggerating. The board will back me up. They always do. You won't make this stick. Hartman's expression never changed. Then I'll be speaking with your board very soon. Consider this a notice. Your practices, your enforcement methods, and your financial records will all be reviewed. Thoroughly. For the first time, Karen seemed small. Her shoulders, once squared with righteous indignation, slumped beneath the weight of Hartman's gaze. She clutched her clipboard to her chest like a shield, her phone still trembling in her hand. This isn't over, she hissed at me, though her voice cracked around the edges. No, I said, matching her stare. It's just beginning. She spun on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door so violently that dust shook loose from the beams overhead. The echo lingered long after her footsteps faded. The room fell quiet, the fire popping in the hearth the only sound. Hartman turned back toward the table, adjusting his cuffs as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She's exactly as you described, he said calmly, reclaiming his seat. Obsessive. Reckless. Convinced of her own power. But now she's made a mistake she can't cover. I sat opposite him, my pulse still hammering. Do you think this will be enough? Hartman folded his hands, his gaze steady. Oh, it will be more than enough. Tonight, she handed us the leverage we needed. She believes she's untouchable, but she's about to learn how wrong she is. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, a sharp, rising note that pierced the silence. I rose to pull it off the burner, but my thoughts weren't on tea. Karen had just declared war inside my grandfather's cabin. And with Hartman at my side for the first time, I believed we had the means to finally end it. Word of Karen's intrusion spread faster than wildfire in dry brush. By the following week, whispers rippled through the entire Lakeshore Meadows community. Some homeowners shook their heads in outrage, appalled that she had gone so far. Others lowered their voices, relief flickering in their eyes, because for years, Karen had ruled them with intimidation cloaked as community standards. Now, the mask was slipping. Attorney General Hartman wasted no time. His office issued subpoenas to the HOA board, demanding financial records, violation logs, and transcripts of board meetings. Certified envelopes arrived in mailboxes like thunderclaps, and suddenly the people who once sang Karen's praises avoided her driveway altogether. I watched it all unfold from the quiet safety of my cabin. For the first time in months, the nights felt lighter. But Hartman warned me not to grow complacent. "She'll fight back," he said one evening as we reviewed documents by lantern light. "People like her don't retreat, they double down. We need to be ready." He was right. Karen held emergency board meetings, spinning the story to anyone who would listen. She painted herself as the victim of a witch hunt, a president unfairly targeted for doing her duty. But cracks appeared quickly. 2 board members resigned within days rather than be dragged into her mess. Another, a soft-spoken retiree named Linda, quietly contacted Hartman's office and handed over proof that Karen had been issuing fines without board approval. It was worse than I'd imagined. Karen hadn't just targeted me. She had turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom. Residents were fined for lawn lengths, mailbox colors, even the style of curtains in their windows. If they resisted, she threatened escalating penalties and, in several cases, pressured families to sell their homes at deflated values. One couple admitted they'd moved away entirely just to escape her harassment. The evidence piled higher each day. Misuse of funds, falsified meeting minutes, intimidation of residents. It became clear that Karen wasn't a rule enforcer. She was a tyrant hiding behind a rulebook. Still, she clung to her power. One night at the grocery store, she cornered me near the frozen food aisle. Her posture was stiff, her eyes bloodshot with exhaustion, yet her voice still dripped venom. "You think you've won?" she hissed, low enough that only I could hear. "You've ruined everything. My reputation, my work, my community, all because you couldn't follow the rules." I met her glare, without flinching.
No, Karen.
"You ruined it yourself. You crossed a line the moment you stepped into my cabin. Now you're facing consequences you can't bully your way out of." Her hands tightened around the cart handle. For a second, I thought she might lash out physically, but instead, she spun away, muttering curses under her breath as she disappeared into the aisles. That moment confirmed what I already knew. Karen wasn't going down quietly. By the time the preliminary hearings began, the community was split between those who still clung to her and those who saw her for what she was. The courthouse steps filled with residents clutching folders, ready to testify about years of harassment. Some trembled as they spoke. Others seemed relieved to finally say aloud what they had endured. I took my turn as well, recounting the months of escalating pressure, the bogus violation notices, the sabotage nets, the inspectors randomly showing up at my door. And, of course, the night she forced her way into the cabin. Hartman listened with the same steady calm he'd shown that evening by the fire. When I finished, he placed a reassuring hand on the table. "This isn't just your fight anymore. It's everyone's. And that's what makes it powerful." Karen sat across the room during my testimony, her jaw locked, her knuckles white around her papers. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes beyond fury.
Fear. Still, she fought.
Her attorneys argued she had acted within the spirit of community duty. They claimed homeowners had consented to strict enforcement when buying their properties and that she was only protecting values. But the paper trail told another story, a story of greed, intimidation, and self-appointed dominion. The hearing stretched on, each day peeling another layer from the facade she had built. And yet, even as the weight of evidence pressed down, Karen continued to insist she was the victim of a conspiracy. The drama reached its peak when Hartman revealed an internal memo signed by Karen herself, detailing tactics to pressure non-compliant homeowners into either selling or relocating. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even some of her staunchest defenders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen's face drained of color, but she didn't yield. Instead, she slammed her binder shut and spat across the aisle. "This is a circus. None of you understand what it takes to keep order." The judge silenced her with a firm rap of the gavel. "Order will be kept here, Ms. Mitchell. By the law, not by intimidation." The gavel's echo lingered in my ears long after the session adjourned. For the first time, it felt like the tide had turned completely. But Hartman warned me again as we left the courthouse. "She's cornered. And a cornered opponent is the most dangerous kind. Be prepared." The fight wasn't over yet. The final ruling loomed, and with it, the question of whether Karen's reign of control would truly end, or whether she'd claw for one last desperate strike. The final hearing drew a crowd that stretched down the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing as residents filed in with folded papers and tight expressions. The air buzzed with the anticipation of a trial that felt less like a legal proceeding and more like the climax of a drama everyone had been forced to live through. Inside, the courtroom hummed with tension. Karen sat at the defendant's table, shoulders squared but face drawn, her once impenetrable poise unraveling under fluorescent lights. The clipboard she used to wield like a weapon was gone, replaced by a stack of crumpled notes clutched between restless fingers. Her lawyers whispered urgently at her side, but she stared straight ahead, jaw locked. Attorney General Hartman commanded the opposite table. His composure never wavered, his voice steady as he laid out the case with surgical precision. He presented violation logs riddled with inconsistencies, bank statements revealing unapproved transfers, and testimony from residents describing threats and fabricated fines. Each document landed like a hammer strike. Each witness chipped away at the wall Karen had built around herself. When my turn came, I stepped forward and told my story plainly. I described the cabin's history, the notices slipped under my door, the sabotage I had endured, and finally, the night she crossed into my home without permission. As I spoke, I didn't look at the audience or the judge. I looked directly at Karen. For the first time, she didn't return the glare. Her eyes flickered down to her papers, as though even she could no longer deny the weight of what she had done. When I finished, Hartman rose. "Your Honor, this is not a matter of one homeowner versus an HOA president. This is a matter of abuse of authority. Ms. Mitchell wielded power not to protect the community, but to control it. And tonight, this court has the opportunity to affirm that no one, not even a self-proclaimed enforcer, is above the law." The judge leaned forward, his gaze heavy over his spectacles. The room hushed to stillness. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice measured, "the evidence presented paints a clear and troubling picture. You overstepped your authority, engaged in harassment, and misused HOA funds for personal influence. This court finds your actions unlawful." Karen's hands tightened around her papers until they crumpled. "Effective immediately," the judge continued, "the Lakeshore Meadows HOA is placed under state oversight pending reorganization. You, Ms. Mitchell, are barred from serving on any board or holding fiduciary responsibility. You will be fined for damages and referred for criminal review regarding misappropriated funds." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The silence that followed was broken not by outrage, but by relief. A murmur rose from the gallery, residents exchanging glances, some even smiling, as though the weight they had carried for years had suddenly lifted. Karen sat motionless, pale and rigid, her empire of rules collapsing around her. The lawyers at her side began gathering papers, but she didn't move. Only her eyes shifted, narrowing at me with a venom that hadn't died. Even stripped of power, she clung to bitterness. I didn't return the glare. For once, She no longer deserved my energy. Outside, the crowd spilled into the evening air, voices overlapping in cautious celebration. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another in years shook hands, trading stories of long-hidden grievances, now validated. It felt as if the community itself was breathing freely for the first time. Hartman found me on the steps, his expression lighter than I'd ever seen it. "It's done," he said simply. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "For good." He gave a small nod. "She'll try to play the victim, maybe stir sympathy. But the record is clear. The law will do what it needs to." The autumn sun dipped low over the courthouse, casting the steps in gold. For the first time in months, I thought of my grandfather, not with the ache of someone fighting to protect his legacy, but with gratitude. The cabin would remain, untouched and free, as he had intended. That evening, back at the lake, the world felt different. Lighter. Neighbors who once averted their eyes now waved from their docks. Laughter drifted across the water, where silence used to hang heavy. Hartman stopped by briefly, sharing a cup of coffee by the fire before heading out. As he rose to leave, he looked back at me with a faint smile. "Freedom tastes good, doesn't it?" I nodded. "Better than I imagined." The flames crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. Karen had walked into my cabin believing she could enforce her will. Instead, she had sealed her own downfall. And in the end, justice had come not just for me, but for everyone she had ruled.